Right, hello and welcome to this, which is a walking talking mock of the AQA GCSE paper 1, and it's going to focus on one of the AQA sample papers, which is a fiction extract entitled Glass, Bricks and Dust. In order to complete this, you're going to need to get together some materials. Firstly, you'll need an extract of you'll need the Glass, Bricks and Dust extract. You're also going to need the question paper. Those were handed out to Whitby students in the green and yellow covered folders with all the other AQA practice papers. You're also going to need some writing paper for you to attempt your own answer, and you're going to need your pens for highlighting and underlining. So if I just explain exactly what we're going to do, I'm going to talk you through the paper. We're going to look at skills for annotation. We're going to look at exactly the demands and the requirements of each question, and hopefully this will help you guys when it comes to sitting your exam, because I think this is a paper that really rewards pupils who know exactly what the questions are requiring. So at this point you need to make sure that you've got all of your materials together, and once they're up together you should spend 5 minutes reading the extract. Okay, so first of all let's have a look at question 1. Question 1 asks you to read the first part of the source from lines 1 to 7, and it asks you to list 4 things from this part of the source about the boy. It's worth 4 marks. This question should take about 5 minutes. In order to complete it, you need to identify the topic focus of the question. It will ask you to identify information about a specific part of the text, and it's really important, if you're going to get all 4 of these marks, to identify what that is. You should reread the section of the text. My advice would be to underline everything that you think would answer the question, and then to select the 4 that you are most secure about. The advice in the bottom box there suggests that you frame your answers using the topic focus of the question. So where the question says identify 4 things about the boy, you should start your answer with the boy is, the boy is, the boy is, the boy is. And responding in that way will help to make sure that you are focused on the question and that you don't get misled and accidentally include information that's about, say, the setting. Okay, so pause the video now. You've got 5 minutes to complete this one, and you should write out your answers using the topic focus. Okay, so here's the extract, and here's how you should have gone about doing it. We know that we're answering just on this opening section from 1 to 7, and we know that we're looking for 4 things about the boy. Let's have a look. First of all, the boy was crouched on top of the mound. He was making a new town out of a heap of broken glass. Now, you could say, well, this is how many things? He's crouched on top of the mound, he's making a new town out of a heap of broken glass. I think that counts as one thing, but I would probably just use the first piece of the information, he's crouched on top of the mound. Here, he liked this time of day best. That's clearly about the boy, so that's our second thing. This sentence here is the kind of thing that could mislead you potentially. The air seemed to get grainy as it colour changed from the vinegary yellow to candy floss blue. That's a line there that's clearly not about the boy. He could rub it between his fingers like dust and slow time down. So the boy could rub the air between his fingers and slow time down. Curious sentence, but remember, we're only looking for basic information. We don't need to interpret anything. At the top of the mound, he was in charge. Here we've got a 4th piece of information. And he didn't want to go home to bed. I think that's a 5th separate thing about the boy. He collected green glass shards and broken brown bottlenecks. I think that's our 6th piece of information about him. He tumbled fragments of old window in his hands like shattered marbles. 7. He pushed the glass into the mound, making houses, balancing roofs on them, building towers. This to me seems like the 8th thing. And then finally, the last of the sunlight caught and glinted in the tiny glass walls. Again, this is one piece that's not about the boy. As you can see, there's an awful lot of information to choose from there. So it's about selecting the information that you think is most clearly about the boy. Following the advice that you were given earlier, okay, you should have prefaced your responses with these: the boy, the boy, the boy, the boy, and that will help to keep you focused and ensure that you get all 4 available marks for that question. Okay, question 2. Question 2 is a language question, and it will ask you to look at a section of the source. So here we've been asked to look from lines 5 to 15, and you should definitely start by identifying that section on your annotation, identifying it on the extract that you've been given. The question asks, how does the writer use language here to describe the boy playing in the evening? It also gives you some advice. It says you could include the writer's choice of words and phrases, language features and techniques, and sentence forms. Notice that the advice says you could include. You do not have to include all of those 3 things. You should focus on what you think you can best explain. If you think that sentence forms are difficult to explain, and I think that they often are, then you should avoid that and you should focus instead on the language features. Here's some advice for completing question 2. It's an 8-mark question, and if you, unless you have extra time, it should take you about 10 minutes to complete it. You should start this question by underlining the topic focus. It will ask you to focus on language that presents a particular subject, and you may lose marks if your response isn't focused on the actual focus of the question. So always begin by underlining the topic focus of the question so you've got clear in your head what it is you're looking for language on. Secondly, you should read the section and highlight 3 short quotes, at least 3 short quotes to use in your evidence. Remember, you're looking for the language methods that are used, and it certainly helps to be able to use the right terminology for your language, so to know what technique is being used, and you should label those on your annotation. Finally then, you will write up your response and comment on how the methods used present the topic that you've been asked. Okay, there's some help on this slide that you might pause the video here and use this to help you respond to the question. I've got here some sentence starters that help you to explain the effect of language. They're in italics on the left there in the box at the bottom. I've also listed some of the key language methods that you can look for, such as emotive language, descriptive language. Anything sensory is always good for explaining. The use of dialogue, whether there's figurative language such as metaphor, simile, personification, or there's repetition. If you can't find any particular techniques, then it's always wise to focus on the words that have been chosen. Where writers have used adjectives or chosen particular verbs, or perhaps a phrase that could be significant, it's always worth identifying the kind of language that they've chosen and what you think the effect is. And that brings me to this simplified mark scheme here. In order to be successful at this question, you have to explain the effect of the language on the reader. So it's not good enough to just identify language and label it with the correct terms. You must explain what it's showing the reader, or how it's affecting the reader, how it guides our feelings, our emotions, our attitudes, or our impressions towards the subject. Okay. At this point you should pause and you should take 10 minutes to look at lines 5 to 15. Remember that you're focused here on how he describes the boy playing in the evening. Follow the advice given on this slide. Take 10 minutes to complete. Okay, we're looking at question 2, the language question, and a review on how to complete a response to how the writer has used language to describe the boy playing in the evening. Now I know that we're going from line 5 to line 15, so I really like to identify that. You'll notice I'm using a different colour here. If you're able to take different colour, I've gone blue I've gone blue pen for the language question. If you're able to take different coloured pens into the exam, then that's a really good idea for making sure that you annotate different questions in different colours, and that can help you not to get mixed up when you write up your responses. Obviously, you must remember that you've got to write in black ink. Okay, so we're reading from line 5 to 15, and we're looking for any language features that we think are presenting the way that the boy plays. So to start with, he collected green glass shards and broken brown bottlenecks. He tumbled fragments of old window in his hands like shattered marbles. He pushed the glass into the mound, making houses, balancing roofs on them, building towers. If you look at these three sentences, they've all got a similar opening here. We've got he collected, he tumbled, he pushed. Okay, and that repetition to me seems to be significant. So I've identified those three as something that I can talk about. The technique used here is anaphora, which is a repetition at the beginning of different sentences or clauses. You don't necessarily need the correct technique name. Obviously, it helps to use the correct term and it may gain you an extra mark. But the key thing is to think about, well, what's the writer doing here? Well, each opening has got a different verb: collected, tumbled, pushed. And those verbs are kind of creating a sense of the boy's activity and his action. He seems to be really actively engaged, maybe engrossed in what he's doing. So 1, 2, 3, I'm going to label those as my first thing to write about. You could call it a repetition. The particular name of repetition here is anaphora. It uses verbs and it creates a sense of activity, busyness. Okay, reading on, it continues. More of the blackbirds than he'd ever seen before rushed overhead and gathered on the lamppost. The orange light hadn't yet switched on, but the shadows were growing. Well, this to me seems to be significant. The shadows were growing. This is creating a sense of the change in atmosphere and the change of the time of day. But as you know, writers frequently use atmosphere to change tone in their writing or to mirror some way what's going on in terms of thoughts. So I think this is an example of pathetic fallacy. Okay, particularly this idea that the shadows were growing. That verb seems to suggest to me like a change for the worst, and it seems to almost suggest to the reader that something mysterious is going to happen. We might also link that here to this: more of the blackbirds than he'd ever seen before rushed overhead. Particularly this rushed. The blackbirds rushed. Well, that to me again seems to be somewhat curious. Why is the writer focused on this? Black obviously is the colour that we associate with darkness, and that's linked to this shadows were growing. So is this contributing to the pathetic fallacy? I think so. Okay. We'll have this, I think, as our second thing to write about. He heard 9 chimes of the town hall clock. Well, here the writer has introduced a different sense. So far, these parts have been visual. We've had the action of the boy. We've had a couple of sentences that establish the atmosphere. But here we've got 9 chimes. And this is a sound. Ringing bells possibly contribute to this slightly dark atmosphere. I mean, on surface level, it just signals that it's 9 o'clock. You might think that's not significant, but I think working with these rushing black birds and these growing shadows, it seems to me that the 9 chimes are suggesting that something's changing or something significant is happening. And of course, the writer has done that here by introducing a different sense. So we can imagine the scene visually, but we can also imagine the sound of it. In the final part of this section, we get the strange occurrence of the figure. For a moment, the lamppost looked like a tall, thin man wearing a large black hat. When the man turned towards him, he looked like a lamppost. In these two sentences here, something really strange has happened. In the first sentence, we've got a lamppost that looks like a tall, thin man with a large black hat. In the second sentence, we've got a man who looks like a lamppost. So these two sentences is kind of giving us this odd transformation where 1 minute there's a lamppost and the second minute the lamppost is a man. The man, it gets described here, had a greyish green coat speckled with rust and a black hat that quivered with beaks and feathers. So it's interesting in the description of the man that his coat is speckled with rust and his black hat quivered with beaks and feathers. So it seems that the man has taken on some of the features of the lamppost with the birds perched on it. Now, one thing we might ask ourselves here is, if we're responding about the description of the man, are we focused on the topic focus of the question, which is the way that the boy is playing? It seems that the writer here is trying to show us that this man is part of the boy's game. He's part of the boy's imagination. So it seems to me that we can explain the way that the man is described, and we'll still be talking about the boy's game, or at the very least talking about the boy's imagination, which is part of his game. Particularly in here, we've got the coat is speckled with rust. So we've got this verb, speckled, and we've also got this verb here, quivered, okay, which seems really, quivered particularly seems to create an unusual sense about the man, as if it's weird enough having beaks and feathers on your hat. These are quivering, so it's almost as if his hat is alive, which is certainly raising the reader's curiosity about this figure. Okay. Finally, then, we get this rather threatening sentence. The man didn't need to climb the mound. He was face to face with the boy, which shows how the boy and the man are close. And I think this phrase here, face to face, has an almost threatening tone. Okay. So I'm going to write up the description of the man as my third thing to focus on. So you can see here I've chosen 1, 2, 3 elements of language to focus on, and in each one I've got more than one thing that I want to, more than one quote, if you like, that I want to pick out. One thing that's worth noting is that for your annotations, it's always worth focusing on short and concise highlighting. Okay, we don't need to be quoting full sentences. In fact, it often helps to embed short quotes that are linked in your writing. So if you bear with me, we're going to attempt to write that up now, and we'll try and write one good response to this. Okay, so I've written up a response to this question 2 language question based on the notes that we made here, and I'm going to talk you through it and explain why I think that this is a good response and why it does things that the examiner will reward. Okay. First of all, I opened my response with a very quick overview of what I think is happening in this section. So if you can read my handwriting, it says, in this section the writer uses language to establish a mystical and sinister tone, showing how the boy's game is blurring the lines between reality and imagination. And that's just my overall feeling about what's going on in that section. This isn't necessary, but this is certainly useful for a top-end answer, because it establishes that the student has got an overall awareness of what's happening. And these ideas, mystical, sinister, reality and imagination, they're going to be useful in my explanations, because I'm going to try and explain how the language I've identified has this effect on the reader. Okay. In my first paragraph here, I say that the writer describes the boy's game with a series of verbs that show the reader his actions. He collected, tumbled and pushed the glass around. These verbs create a sense of the boy being totally engaged in his play, making, balancing and building. Now, I did speak about, when we were annotating, about making short, concise annotations. What I've tried to model here for you is embedding quotes. Embedding quotes is really effective because it enables you to handle a lot of information from the text and link it together meaningfully. So all of these verbs, collected, tumbled and pushed, making, balancing and building, they all create this sense of the boy being completely engaged in his play. He's immersed in it, and bringing them all together in this way makes it quite a persuasive point. I've also got the correct term. Doesn't need to be a complex term. I've just identified these words as verbs, and this is showing that I can understand a pattern of the writer's language. Okay. Second paragraph comes on here. The writer then introduces a sinister side to the boy's play, using pathetic fallacy to suggest to the reader that the atmosphere is changing. And I've introduced my quote here with a dash. The last of the sunlight caught and glinted in the tiny glass walls. Here I'm going to zoom back into a word from my quote. I've given quite a chunky quote. It's a full sentence. And I'm going to come back in here with this phrase "in particular," which is a really good way of starting a sentence that is going to conduct what we call a word level analysis. You might call this zooming. So I'm going to zoom back in on a word here. In particular, the verb "caught" personifies the sunlight. Remember, the sunlight caught and glinted the glass walls. It personifies the sunlight, suggesting to the reader that the appearance of the walls is remarkable and strange. So it's very simple. I've taken my chunky quote, if you like, and I've gone back in and zoomed in on a word here. I continue here to talk about pathetic fallacy because, as you saw in the annotation, I'm trying to link and connect evidence together, and I think there's more than one aspect of pathetic fallacy in this writing. The pathetic fallacy is continued on line 10, where the writer describes shadows were growing. This shows the reader how the darkness is approaching and gives a sense that the scene is changing. And I continued here. The overall effect is threatening, and the writer adds to this tone by including the sound of 9 chimes. By stimulating a range of different senses, the writer is indicating to the reader that something significant is about to happen. We are in a state of expectation and heightened awareness. Rereading this, I don't think I've made explicit, perhaps, that 9 chimes is... Oh no, I have. I've identified it as a sound here. Okay, so I'm trying to argue that a range of different sounds are being used, a range of different senses are being used, and that this is helping to show the reader that something significant is about to happen. This question rewards you when you explain the effect on the reader. So my last sentence here, which doesn't actually contain any evidence, is trying to do just that. I'm trying to explain what the writer is indicating to the reader, what they're showing. So our impression is that something significant is about to happen, and that we're in this state of expectation, realizing that something's changing, and we have this heightened awareness. We're looking out for change. Okay, we're on to question 3, which is the structure question on paper 1. Question 3 instructs you to think about the whole of the source, and it will also tell you where the source is from. So usually we have the sources are usually at the opening of a book or of a novel, but this one is from the middle of a short story, and that could potentially be useful information for us when we're thinking about structure. Certainly useful to know if it's the very beginning of a novel, because we can think about how a writer is interesting the reader at the beginning of the novel. The question will not change, which is what I think makes this quite a good question to do. It says, how does the writer structure the text to interest you as a reader? How has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? And it gives you some suggestions about what you could write about. You could write about what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning, how and why the writer changes this focus as the source develops, or any other structural features that interest you. And this idea of changing focus, which is in the second bullet point there, is quite important to the way that you answer this question. This question's caused quite a lot of panic. It's a new question for the GCSE, and I don't think it's been done brilliantly, but I actually think it's quite an easy question. Not easy, but it's quite an accessible question when you know how to answer it. So follow this advice carefully. The question should take you about 10 minutes, perhaps a little over 10 minutes to complete. And it's always going to ask you how the text is structured to interest the reader. Now, the key word in that question is interest. And you have to ask yourself, what is it that's keeping a reader interested in this extract? Now, you might read it and say, well, I'm not interested in it. Okay, fine. But what would interest a reader who wanted to read this story? What about it would keep the reader interested? Now, understanding that keyword interest helps you to keep your response focused on what really matters in this extract. Some of the details that the writer includes will be perhaps less interesting than others. And in order to get towards the top of the marks on this question, you have to really show an understanding of what it is that's keeping that reader engaged. First advice is that you're going to need to, I think, reread the extract to complete this question. And my advice is to number off the paragraphs. This was advice that was given to you in the examiner's session. And that's something that's very quick to do, and it's very easy because it will help you in your response. You can actually write in your response to the examiner in the fourth paragraph, this happens. Okay. For point 2 there, you should reread the extract and identify changes in focus in the margin. This means that for each section of the text as you reread, where the focus changes, and it might change from setting to character, or it might change from one character to another character, or it might change from what we call external action to internal action, which would be sort of thoughts and feelings. Wherever there's a change in focus, just write a word or a couple of words in the margin that show what that focus is changing into. Okay. Point 3 there. You need to then reread, once you've identified changes in focus, you need to identify which of these changes in focus are most interesting to you or helping to interest the reader. And then you finally write up your response, and you have to explain how the writer has guided the reader in order to keep them interested. I've put some additional advice for you here when you attempt this question. You can see in the two parallel boxes on the right hand side of your screen, you know that examiners are looking out for terminology, and sometimes pupils attempt the structure question. They use some really quite complex complex terminology about structure. I actually think that the terms that you need are probably a little bit more simple and everyday than some of the specialist terms that we use in the language question. So I've included here a list of verbs that explain how a writer uses structure. So these are verbs that describe the writer's action. A writer could be guiding the reader. A writer could be building or creating tension. A writer can be climaxing in their writing. They can be establishing or resolving, linking. They can be suggesting or hinting, or they can be introducing. And I think these are really useful words to get a meaningful response out of you. We know that we're not just focused on the writer's methods, but we also, to get to the top of the band, we have to explain how a reader might respond. So there's some words here that could describe a reader's response. That we respond with curiosity about something, or we might respond with a sense of excitement, concern, suspicion, dread, surprise. So these are all words that will help you to explain the reader's response. if in this response you can bring together your understanding of what the writer is doing and the effect of it on the reader, then your response will climb up the marks. Okay, so pause at this point, reread the extract, number off the paragraphs, identify changes in focus, and look for those key events that are helping to keep the reader's interest, and perhaps how they change as the extract moves on. Okay, now we're going to annotate this extract for structure, and looking particularly for changes in focus and how they keep the reader interested. In our opening paragraph, we're very much focused on the boy, and we know that because we've responded to this in question 1. So paragraph 1 is focused on the boy and his game, and it establishes that. In the second paragraph here, we'll label this paragraph 2, we have this strange appearance of the figure, the lamppost man. In the third paragraph, actually it's slightly awkward here because this extract isn't clearly paragraphed past the third paragraph, but there are changes in focus within this. So although we might identify the whole thing as paragraph 3, when you read it you realise that there are changes in focus that I think in this first section we get dialogue between the boy and the man. In this middle section here, the boy runs through the town looking for his parents, and he doesn't get back to the man until here. So here we might label this as the town. And then finally we get a final section of dialogue between the man and the boy. So after rereading, we've numbered off the paragraphs and we've identified changes in focus. But in order to identify what's really interesting about this, we need to look particularly at the points within these changes in focus that interest the reader. Well, in this opening section, we've got a boy playing on a mound. Is that interesting? Not especially. That's a fairly everyday occurrence. There's nothing particularly strange or unusual about that. But here we get this sentence that he could rub the air between his fingers like dust and slow time down. So particularly this, slow time down, this is something quite unusual, and it's asking the reader to question quite what's going on, because a boy playing on a mound is not interesting, but a boy who can slow time down, that's unusual. That's definitely interesting. The second point of interest we've got is in this second paragraph when the figure appears. And we had the two sentences that we looked at in the language question where a lamppost appears to suddenly turn into the man. So this appearance of the strange figure is our second point here. The man had a greyish-green coat. When the man turned towards him, he looked like a lamppost. So the introduction of this man is a mysterious figure, one that we don't fully understand, and we have a lot of unanswered questions about this man. So whilst we get established that something is strange, here we get a development of this appearance of the strange figure. When we look at the dialogue section here, we get this slightly awkward and vaguely threatening exchange between the boy and the man, particularly where he says, every child is always making something, shake them out and they're full of dust and dreams. And there's no real clear understanding of what that means, but it seems like the man is suggesting you can shake children out, which makes you worry a little bit about this man, whether he's harmful or not. Finally, in this section anyway, we get this appearance of the tiny creatures. Tiny creatures were scuttling beneath the glass roofs, and that's a change because when the boy was playing earlier, those tiny figures weren't here. So whilst the man has appeared, also we've got these strange creatures appearing, and that's forcing us to ask ourselves, well, has the man created these figures? Is this part of the boy's imagination? But it's clearly a structural moment, the introduction of these figures, that's helping to engage our interest. In the middle section, the boy runs through the town, and we get this slow, gradual realization, especially from these questions here, that something is not right. And finally, we get the fact that his mum has disappeared and her half-drunk cup of tea is still on the side. So we've got the disappearance of the people to add to our curiosity about the figure and about the appearance of these creatures within the game. Finally, then, the writer kind of connects all of these points for us by suggesting heavily that the creatures in the game are the disappeared people from the town. And that's achieved here, where the boy shouts, "Give them back," as if he feels that the man has taken the people from taken the real people from the town and put them in the game. And then the boy looks down, and these little figures are still there, but they're no longer moving. So we've got another change here that suggests that something perhaps even more sinister has happened to our tiny creatures. Now, what we're doing here is we're looking for a thread of interest that runs through this extract. For me, the things that are interesting me as I read this are the identity of the figure. Who is he? Is he real, or is he part of the boy's imagination? And also, what's happening to these tiny figures? The child has lost his mum, which is quite a worrying occurrence, and it seems to suggest that the mum or the people in the town are trapped in the game. So I'm interested in two things here: the identity of the man and the identity of these tiny creatures. These are my two unanswered questions, and the writer's structured this to slowly introduce my understanding of what's going on. Strange occurrence at the opening where the boy can slow time down, this appearance of the figure, the appearance of these tiny figures, the absence of people from the town, and then returning to these tiny figures, but that are no longer moving. In the end, the man turns back into a lamppost, and that leaves things kind of unresolved for me, because I'm concerned that the boy has lost his loved ones, and the fact that the man has turned back into a lamppost and isn't answering his question leaves me feeling concerned about what's happened. All of these parts together form what we might call a kind of golden thread. 1, 2, the appearance of the man. 3, the appearance of the figures. 4, the absence of people in the town. 5, return to the figures and the fact that they are. And then 6, this unresolved ending. And you might, on your extract, track the most interesting points into almost a map of how the writer is developing your understanding as the extract goes on. Okay, so here's a model response to question 3 following the annotation that we just completed. As with question 2, I've made a short introductory statement that shows that I understand overall what the writer is trying to achieve, and it's focused around that keyword interest. So in this extract, the writer has structured her writing, to interest the reader in the mysterious identity of the figure and the fate of the people who have disappeared. And this brief overview sentence is important because it's going to help me to explain later on, because I'm going to come back to the things that interest the reader, which is the identity of the figure and what's happened to these disappeared people. In the opening, the writer establishes the boy's game, but gives the reader some suggestion that it is unusual because he can slow time down. This creates the expectation that unusual things are going to happen. Once again, this response is focused on the effect on the reader. So the writer is creating the reader's expectation about unusual things happening. The introduction of the strange figure in paragraph 2 builds tension for the reader by creating ambiguity. Remember that ambiguity is situations that are unclear, unresolved, unanswered questions. It's hard for the reader to decide if the figure is real or just part of the boy's imagination. So this here is exploring the thought processes of the reader and considering the effect that the writer's structure has had. This ambiguity keeps the reader interested as they're looking for clues as to the figure's identity. In the middle section, the writer develops the relationship between the boy and the figure by using dialogue. The dialogue presents the relationship as tense and awkward, especially where the figure suggests that children are full of dust and dreams. Here, the writer is building tension with the figure's threatening remarks, and the reader may question whether he intends to harm the boy or if he is just a part of the boy's game. So it's about thinking, at this stage in the text, what does the reader know, and why is it interesting? Of course, the reader's understanding is developing as the section goes on, and the writer increases tension in his description of the boy's frantic search for his parents. Here, the action shifts into the boy's thoughts as he questions the disappearance of all of the people. Following the boy's thoughts, the reader gradually realizes that the town is mysteriously abandoned and starts to question the link between the tiny creatures in the boy's playtown and the absence of the people. This connection is completed when the figure says, "I haven't got them, you have." At this point, the reader's concerns are proved that the people have been trapped in the boy's game. By the end of the extract, the reader is concerned for the boy's welfare, especially the disappearance of his mother. The writer maintains this tension at the end by turning the figure back into a lamppost and leaving the boy powerless to do anything, and the tension about the fate of his mother is left unresolved. I'm fairly pleased with that response, and I think it's a solid response to the question. There are perhaps some ways that I could have improved it. I think looking back at the annotation that we made, I could have made a bit clearer the link between our tiny creatures here, the disappearance of the people, and this return to focusing on the tiny creatures who are now no longer moving. I don't think I've perhaps dealt with this change between point 3 and point 5 there, and how that creates a really sinister effect for the reader. This idea that they're no longer moving makes us definitely concerned. Is his mother in there? Is she dead? That they're no longer moving. So if I were to rewrite that, I would definitely focus more on following this thread that I identified in the text. But it's a strong response in as much as it does a few really positive things. It's very focused on the effect that things have on the effect that the structure has on the reader, and it also focuses on how the writer is actively creating these things, how the writer is establishing and building tension, and how the writer leaves it unresolved at the end. Okay, so we've reached question 4, which is the final reading question on paper 1, and this question is worth 20 marks out of 40 for the whole of the reading paper. So this question is half the reading paper. That makes it a vital question, and it means you have to make time for it. You should be looking to spend between 20 and 25 minutes on this question, so it's a little bit closer to a full essay, and you're going to need to develop your ideas in some detail to access as many of those 20 marks as you can get. Firstly, read carefully the part that specifies which section of the text that you're responding to. It seems to be that they often focus this question on the second half of the extract, and I think that's intentionally done to ensure that you can't focus on the part that you focused on in the language question. So it doesn't overlap with the language question, question 2. You can see on this one, it asks you to focus your answer on the source from line 16 to the end. The question's then going to give you an opinion about the extract. And this one says, the end part of the extract, where the boy's game comes to life, takes a darker and more chilling tone. You have to answer to what extent you agree. There are some bullet points there which help you to guide your response, and they are suggestive, so you don't have to do these, but it would be certainly wise to do all 3, I think. you have to consider your own impressions of the boys' game, evaluate how the writer creates a dark and chilling tone, and support your response with references to the text. Here's some advice on how to complete this question. As I said, it needs to take about 25 minutes, and it's going to ask you how far you agree with a statement about an extract. To start with, you should check that statement carefully and underline the key words in it. The key words in this question were darker and chilling tone. They're vital because your answer really needs to address the meaning of those two words. Is it darker? Is it creating a chilling tone? And if so, how? Secondly, you then need to reread the text, or at least that section of the text, and highlight any evidence that you think links to the claim, whether you think it supports it, or possibly whether it maybe doesn't support it. Then you have to decide how the writer is presenting this subject to you. So this question has to focus on the methods used. It's not just enough to say that the writer is making it darker and is making it chilling. You have to answer on how is the writer making it darker? How is the writer making it more chilling? What is it that the writer is doing to get this effect over to the audience or to the reader? Finally, at point 4, you should number off your best evidence. So once you've selected the things you could write about, it's worth prioritizing them by numbering off 1 to 5 as an example. The best thing you write about first. This ensures that if you run out of time, you've actually numbered off your best evidence. And this is a technique that we've been using right through this walking, talking mock. Then write up your response and remember to stay focused on the statement, whether you agree or disagree. In the bottom left-hand column there, you can see some tips. First of all, the claim does not mislead you, or none of the claims that we've seen have been misleading. So it's usually true to some extent. But the question is asking you how far you agree. Do you totally agree, or do you only agree to a certain extent? Don't feel that you... I don't think it's productive to be controversial and to disagree with the statement, because I think that the statement is usually true to some extent. The keywords in that statement are vital in your answer, and you should be repeating them regularly to show that you're actually addressing the claim. As we saw in the language question, it's really useful to be able to embed your quotes and to use a range of evidence. Methods can be confusing. What counts as a method? Method, of course, we know is what the writer is doing to get that across. It's the how. How does a writer establish this tone? Well, first of all, what perspective is the writer using in their writing? Because this is a method that can have different effects. Is it a first-person perspective? Does it address the reader in the second person by using you? That's quite rare in fiction writing, but it can be done. Is it in the third person? How has the writer established tone? How has the writer used dialogue to present characters? What's the quality of the language like? Is there figurative language, sensory language, or descriptive language, sometimes emotive language as well? Has the writer used any repetitions? Has the writer used particular word choices or different sentence types? And finally, how has the writer structured it? So ideas from question 2 and question 3, you can reuse some of those ideas in the evaluate question, particularly if you focused on structure and you think that structure is really helping to create this dark tone, then there's absolutely nothing stopping you from reusing an idea that you used in question 3 in question 4. This is made impossible for the language question because the language focus, the part of the extract that the language question 2 is focused on, usually doesn't fall in the same part of the text that question 4 asks you to look at. So unfortunately you won't be able to recycle the points you made about that language, but you could make the same points if the writers used similar techniques elsewhere. The way this is marked by the examiners is, as all the other questions, it's split into 4 bands. In band 1 you'll have a simple evaluation of effect but no understanding of methods. If you can show some awareness of what the writer is doing, i.e. some understanding of methods, then you can get yourself into level 2. If you can clearly show that you understand the writer's methods and you can clearly evaluate the effect on the reader, you go into 3, and to get up into band 4, it has to be a detailed and critical evaluation of effect and a perceptive understanding of methods. Those two words, effect and methods, run right the way throughout the mark scheme. So, as always, we're thinking about the relationship between the writer and the reader, the writer's methods and the effect that they have on the reader. You should now read and have a look at the extract from line 16 down and annotate using the advice that you've been given here. Okay, so this is a guided annotation for question 4. As I discussed in the advice, we're going to focus on the claim, and it's really worth writing the claim down. The claim has 2 key words in it: darker, question mark, and more chilling, question mark. So we're going to be considering if we agree with these two parts of the claim. Okay. As we read through, we have the dialogue between the boy and the man, which contains this line: every child is always making something. Shake them out and they're full of dust and dreams. For me, the figure saying shake them out, referring to children, is something that's actually a little bit chilling, really. A strange figure, a stranger to the boy, suggesting that children can somehow be shaken out. It's not clear whether that's something he intends to do or something he's done in the past, but it's definitely unusual and slightly chilling. And you can see from the boy's reaction, he's ready to run. So it suggests a slightly fearful tone here, a certain amount of uncertainty in their first dialogue. As we read through, the boy and the man discuss the glass city, and then we get this image of the tiny creatures scuttling beneath the glass roofs. We use that in our structure response, if you remember, but here we get the simile. They look like ants or spiders, but the sky was darkening. It's interesting here that the word darkening, which of course is part of the claim that we're actually examining, is explicitly used in the text here. So, ants and spiders and darkening atmosphere. The man turns back into a lamppost, and then we got the middle section here where the boy plunged through the town looking for signs of people. And as I read this, it struck me that here the boy was being presented in a kind of a growing sense of his desperation, almost reaching panic. This is quite a fast section when you read it. So we've got the boy plunged down the mound and ran, hoping he wouldn't get told off for being late home. Before he reached the end of the street, he knew something was wrong. The world was too quiet. Where were the sounds of cars? Rhetorical question. Of footballs being kicked against walls. There were no shouts from parents calling everyone in. Mum? He pushed open the front door. The house was in darkness, but the telly was switched on. His mum wasn't in any of the rooms. A half-drunk cup of tea had been left on the arm of the settee. And then the boy thundered back. Well, I thought that these two verbs here describing the boy's action definitely linked. How are they presenting his action? Well, I feel like they're presenting him as feeling really rather desperate. These thoughts, these rhetorical questions here could suggest the thoughts that he's having as he slowly realizes that there's no one around. His uncertainty. Is it in some way chilling? Yeah, I think I can argue that it is. Finally then, in this last interaction between the boy and the man, the boy says, "Give them back," he shouted. Nothing happened, but he heard the rustle of feathers. The boy ran to the top of the mound. "Give them back." The boy's tone here is perhaps desperate. And it's an exclamation. And it's also an imperative, an order. But I haven't got them. The man's face glowed. Seems to me that glowed presents the man in a somewhat supernatural light. Normally if we say someone's face glowed, we mean they're happy. But I'm not quite sure. Perhaps it's communicating happiness. The man doesn't seem to worry that these people have disappeared, and his answer, "But I haven't got them." The man's face glowed. "You have." suggests that in some way he's maybe satisfied, but it also could suggest a kind of a supernatural tone. So once again, we've got a verb, supernatural tone. In the gloom, it was hard to make out the tiny creatures behind the glass roofs. They were no longer moving. The boy couldn't be sure what was a particle of rubble and a person sleeping. How do I get them back, he asked, but the man was a lamppost again. We've got some literal darkening of atmosphere with darkening and gloom here. I think the technique here is the pathetic fallacy, because the change in atmosphere, the darkening of the day, I think is also helping to create this sense of a more chilling atmosphere. Okay, overall, what am I going to write about? Well, I think I'm going to write about the initial dialogue, one, which I think is threatening, the man's threatening tone, and the boy's response here, which I will include in that. Then I think I'll probably focus on the presentation of the figures as like ants or spiders, and particularly spiders in that simile, which frequently are sort of symbolic of creepiness. So I will explore this. After, I think I'm going to do the pathetic fallacy and talk about both gloom and darkening, and maybe link these together, because the method I'm fairly confident being used here is the pathetic fallacy. For my fourth piece, I think I'll talk about the boy's desperation and these idea of plunging and thundering back along the streets, and how these verbs create a sense of his desperation and his panic, which I think is contributing to a chilling tone. Finally then, I think I'll probably talk about the appearance of the figure and the fact that his face glowed, and it presents him as a threatening supernatural figure. Okay, to complete our look at question 4, I'm going to show you a model answer now. Actually, this is one that I wrote earlier and wasn't necessarily linked to the annotation that we just did, but I think it's still quite useful for you, and I think it models some of the things that will help you complete this question successfully. First of all, look at the introduction sentence. Seems quite simple, but I guess it's just a way of explaining that I am going to agree with the tone. So the sentence reads, I fully agree that this section of the text conveys a darker and more chilling tone. The points that I listed in my annotation I'm going to use to support this idea. Actually, I'm not going to argue with it in the slightest, because I think it's 100% true in this text that it's darker and more chilling. Okay, and I think that's everything that the writer's trying to achieve. Okay, for my first paragraph. Firstly, the writer creates a chilling tone through the dialogue between the figure and the boy. Here we have method. Dialogue obviously is one of the writer's methods, and it's not just good enough for me to identify the method, but I need to explain how it's working and the effect that it has on the reader. The figure talks about children and says, shake them out and they're full of dust and dreams. This is a mysterious and unsettling comment. Okay, well that's, I guess, simple enough, and that might work as a clear explanation. But the analysis or the detail required for level 4 comes by perhaps zooming in at word level. So one of my favourite little phrases for zooming at word level, in particular, the violent verb shake suggests force or violence towards children. We don't like to think of strange adults shaking children, and that's, I guess, that's what that word is implying, that this man somehow shakes children, or that can be done, and that is, I think, unsettling and mysterious. As the boy and the figure are alone together, this dialogue suggests that the figure is potentially harmful. The boy is ready to run, indicating that he is vulnerable and afraid of the figure. If I was to improve this paragraph, I think I would probably, if I redid it, suggest or make really explicit, make really clear how this links to the darker tone. But I think I've done it clearly enough by suggesting that it's potentially harmful and that the boy is vulnerable. Secondly, the description of the creatures inside the boy's game creates a chilling tone. They're described as like ants or spiders. Here the simile shows us how the creatures are small, but also suggests a dark tone because spiders are often associated with fear. This fearful tone is reinforced with the verb scuttling, suggesting quick and maybe panicked movements. The uncertainty of the figures is shown as they are moving too fast to be sure. Okay, so in this response I focused on a simile, and you'll often, I think, find yourself focusing on a metaphor or a simile in a writer's writing. Fiction writers and non-fiction writers choose their metaphors and similes very carefully. Metaphors and similes often show us something on the surface level, but they often suggest something a little deeper as well. So I think that the writer's use of ants and spiders here, the main thing that that's indicating is it's showing us the size of the creatures in the boy's game. But ants and spiders, we often refer to them as kind of creepy crawlies, don't we? They have as well a certain kind of fearful quality. People perhaps aren't very comfortable with insects. So I think that particularly the writer has chosen ants and spiders, not just because they indicate the size of the creatures, but also because they're creating this fearful tone. And I think I've linked that here to this idea that they're scuttling. Once again, you can see that the quotes, I'm looking to embed quotes and pick out single words. You can really help yourself in your annotation by simply only highlighting or underlining the really key words, the words themselves that are conveying meanings, and then trying to embed those into the flow of your own sentences. And that can enable you to deal with a larger amount of evidence than just putting in chunky quotes in your writing. The full response that I made to this question will be made available. I will screenshot questions 1 to 4 and make them available so that you can read the full response and check how they're doing. If you've enjoyed this run through of the reading paper and you found it useful, then I would suggest that you go on and have a look at another one and perhaps independently attempt one of these. You may have been given one of these AQA sample question papers. If not, you really would do well to get your hands on them. The one that we've gone through is paper 1 reading, so you could tick that one off here. You've done glass, bricks and dust. It would be a great opportunity now for you to go and have a look at Brighton Rock and see if you can apply the same techniques that we've used. Okay, and the only thing to say is good luck.